it does.
Mr Speaker.
I call the Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Speaker, there's a couple of things that the Minister who's just resumed her seat forgot to mention. Sure, the crime rate's come down. Perhaps that had something to do, Mrs Collins, with the 1,000 extra police officers on the front line that the Labor-led government put on in its last term in office.
Absolutely.
Perhaps it had something to do with totally revamping the thoroughly inadequate, run-down prison system that we inherited from the last national government.
Absolutely.
Perhaps it had something to do with a total overhaul of legislation for the Sentencing Act, the Parole Act, the Proceeds of Crime Act. Perhaps it had something to do with that. But what Mrs Collins hasn't told us is what this budget is doing for policing. This budget represents a real cut to police funding. 125 staffing positions cut, and that's just to begin with. Dozens of police stations, Mrs Collins, will close during this term. You know what I found out, Mr Speaker, about my local police station? I found out that they might not close it, but they will close it to the public. They will close the police station to the public. What does that mean for community policing? I was standing there talking to a member of the police force who's also on the local community board when a woman biked up in distress and said that she had been sexually threatened by a man just down the road. In future, you know what she'll have to do? She'll have to bike to Avondale. That's 9 kilometres away. Do you think she's going to report that crime? Do you think the police are going to be able to respond immediately to it? Not on your life. Police stations, Mr Speaker, mark my words, will close in their dozens, and that is the very opposite of what community policing is meant to be about. Then, the Police Association told my colleague Chris Farfoy here that they are going to cut the pay of frontline police officers over the next 10 years. They're going to cut it. The police minister, the former police minister, boasts about how uncorrupt and competent our police force is, and she's largely right about that. How is it going to help to cut their salaries? But, Mr Speaker, today I don't want to talk about that so much as the evidence last week that we saw of National's education policy to increase class sizes and to cut technology learning in our intermediate schools crash and burn. What a humiliating back down for Hekia Parata. What an embarrassment that was for her and the National Government. I'll give you this guarantee, Mr Speaker, there won't be a single National MP that gets up and praises the National Party's budget policy on education. Right. You know, the only thing I regret about the embarrassment that Hekia Parata faced was that the two major architects of that policy, John Key and Bill English, were nowhere to be seen when she had to front up and back down. They were nowhere to be seen. And don't tell me, members of the National Party, that Bill English didn't know exactly what that budget policy meant. It was in the briefing paper to him as Minister last year. Increase class sizes, it said. And then the Secretary of Treasury, Gabriel Makhlouf, gave a speech just 2 months ago saying the way to improve quality in education was to increase class sizes. Increase class sizes. Did the National Party actually believe that? They parroted it for a fortnight. I bet we never hear it again from them. I was looking at a copy of The Listener the other day, May the 28th, 2005. And there was an interview with one Mr John Key. What was Mr Key saying? He was asked why he sent his children to private schools. And he said, well, really, it's for educational reasons. You know, private schools have small classes and more resources. That's what he said.
One rule.
One rule for Mr Key and one rule for the majority of Cabinet who send their kids to private schools, and another rule for the rest of us whose kids proudly go to public education in this country. And I want to say, if it's good enough for kids in private schools to have small classes so they have more individual learning, then it's good enough for all of our children. If we have a philosophy as New Zealanders, a set of principles and ideology, it's the ideology of fairness. It says some kids will come from privileged and wealthy backgrounds. Fine. Other kids don't. But the really important thing is that every child should get equal opportunity. Every child should be able to achieve his or her potential. And I will fight and fight and fight again against this national government that says we'll put more money into private education, but for the kids that go to public schools, we'll increase their class sizes and we'll close down their technology classes. You know, I don't exempt Ms. Parada from the blame of this policy altogether. She has a job as Minister of Education. I once did that job. Her job was to understand the policy that was being proposed, to subject it to scrutiny, and to make a judgment as to whether it was the right policy. If she knew the impact, and I'll ask Paul Goldsmith this question, if she knew the impact on intermediate schools, why didn't she tell her colleagues? He has no answer. He has no answer, Mr. Speaker. If she knew and she didn't tell her colleagues, that was appallingly bad judgment. And if she didn't know the consequences, that was simply incompetence and inadequacy on her part. You know, we heard her going through the parroting of all of the explanations. You know, there's a commentator, it was in Saturday's Herald. She spouted meaningless blather, repeatedly mouthing platitudes. It's not just good enough to parrot a line. The truth is, and this is word for word, that the Education Minister's botched handling of the cost-cutting blunder, which initially would have seen schools losing up to 5 teacher positions, has brutally exposed her political shortcomings. You know, under a Labor government, education is always on the front bench, and to get on the front bench you have to have political competence to be there. But we've seen anything but political competence from this minister. This policy was a disgrace. It was a disgrace that she was hung out to dry by Bill English, who didn't front up alongside her, despite the fact he knew what that policy meant. And it was an equal disgrace from John Key to support a policy that was absolutely rejected by parents right across our community. You know, it's strange, Mr. Speaker, I often think, how a number of people in this House have benefited from the welfare state in their time of need, but when it comes to extending the hand of help to kids who have need today, they don't want to do it. They just want to cut, they want to make things worse. Mr. Speaker, John Key did say one thing that was interesting on ZB. He said he's not arrogant enough not to listen to what people are saying. Well, I've got some advice for Mr. Key. People in every public opinion poll that has ever been held in this country have said that they do not want to see New Zealand flogging off its public assets. I wonder if Mr. Key is not arrogant enough to ignore their views. Because those on the select committee that have just been going around the country over the last month or two, time and again heard submissions from people utterly and emphatically opposed to the sale of assets. Why would you sell the best performing assets that you've got? The assets that Treasury itself admits are so efficient that privatisation won't improve their efficiency. Why would you sell the assets that returned to us 2 years ago $700 million in 1 year that, as John Key admitted, went towards our hospitals and our schools? Why would you hand over ownership of something that all of us as New Zealanders, as Kiwis, as taxpayers own and benefit from to only those that can afford to pay for it? And why doesn't the government admit that most of those shares, the cornerstone shareholding, will go into foreign ownership? Because that's what Treasury says in its briefing to the government, Mr. Speaker. This was a zero budget, zero extra spending, zero contribution to growth, zero vision, zero hope, and the only thing that it will continue to do is to send New Zealanders, the 1,000 a week that are leaving, out of this country into Australia. In one school in the paper this morning in my electorate, Wesley Intermediate, They've lost 14% of their role in the last year to Australia. Mr. Speaker, this government has failed, this budget is a loser, and we are seeing the last term of this national government.
Hear, hear.
Speaker, I call the Honourable Minister Nathan Guy.
Mr. Speaker, what we've heard there from the former leader of the Labor